Today's webinar is titled Creating a Viable Future Through Sustainable Resource Economies with Laurie Wayburn. And our distinguished guest host today is Peter Stein. We're thrilled to have both of them with us today. Let me say a few words before I hand it over to Peter about his background. He is the managing director of the Lime Timber Company and has extensive experience in conservation-oriented forest land and rural land purchases and dispositions. He's a member of the Board of Advisors of the Appalachian Mountain Club, and he serves on the board of the National Alliance of Forest Owners, as well as of the Monture Museum. He is also notably a past board member of the Forest History Society. So with that, Peter, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
I have the pleasure of introducing actually a very close, old, wonderful friend of mine, Laurie Wayburn. Laurie and I have known each other even before there was a Pacific Forest Trust. And I was also lucky a number of years ago to receive their annual award. I don't know why, but I was lucky, I guess. Laurie is the CEO of Pacific Forest Trust. Laurie actually has to do this kind of work because it's in her DNA. Her dad, who I got to know many years ago, was a doctor, but from my perspective, a brilliant, critical environmental thinker, leader in the San Francisco Bay Area, and very long time board chair of the Sierra Club. So if Laurie attempted to do something else, I don't think, her DNA encoding would allow her. So the reason I'm thrilled to have Laurie present is I've been very involved in the land trust movement forever. I know many land trusts. For better or for worse, if you know one land trust, you know one land trust. But I put Pacific Forest Trust in a very unique position in that they have figured out kind of a remarkable balance, or if you want to be militaristic, sort of a two-edged sword of doing the work that many land trusts do, which is conserving private land. And they are facile and expert at using a mechanism that Laurie will talk a little bit about, and I'll ask her about when we get to the Q&A. But as, if not more importantly, they have been staunch, thoughtful, progressive policy advocates. And out of 13 or 1,400 land trusts in the United States of America, I can only think of one or two others that have as deep a policy focus, particularly around nature-based solutions, the role of forests as a not just a climate solution, but all the co-benefits that are associated with conserving forests. And whether it's AB 32 in California, where they were a leader in the creation of the compliance forest offset market now 15 years ago, to some of the state and federal funding initiatives that support this sort of hybrid public-private partnership between private forest landowners and the natural and community benefits that forests provide. So without further ado, Laurie will take it away. She will do an overview presentation that'll take her a little more than 20 minutes. During that presentation, or even right after that presentation, if you have any questions, you can populate or put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And with help from the Forest History Society staff, I will then present a few of those questions after I get to ask my questions to Laurie. So take it away, Laurie.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you for mentioning my dad, but I'm going to toss my mom in there too, because he could never do what he did with what she did, in terms of so much of his ability to communicate and be a visionary. And thank you to the Forest History Society for inviting me on for this. I'm going to do a screen share now and use some visual aids. And get this to the so I'm going to ask for Peter to give me a thumbs up that the slide is properly showing on the screen. Is that a yes or a no? No, okay. That better? Okay, technology is always our friend. Well, I want to just start by saying I took the liberty of slightly changing the title of this presentation as I was debating it, because initially it was very much focused on really talking about why we need some fundamental changes in the economies that support forests. And then I realized what really matters here is the quality and survival of life on Earth. And that is indeed an existential question. And without forests, we do not have a great shot at that future. So I hope that by the end of this presentation and some of the questions and answers, you all are become convinced of that. So the Pacific Forest Trust, yes, we were founded a little over 30 years ago, and our focus has been on developing financial incentives that reward private landowners for conserving their lands and for sustainable natural forest management, actually. We have, as Peter says, a strong synergy in our work between developing policies that reward forest landowners, putting those into practice on the land, learning from those, and then improving what we do in the policy arena. So it's a more broadly synergistic cycle there. And we've focused on what historically have been called public trust benefits and looking for ways that we can leverage them into solving many of our forest challenges. Our work is grounded in the idea that people are an essential part of forests, and that people need to remain engaged with forests for forests to thrive and for people to thrive. Historically, we've relied on timber harvest to pay the bills for forests, but we also know that that has some limitations. And what forests provide us is far more than just timber. And so we have focused on developing financial income payments or economic payments for habitat services, like for this Pacific fisher, for climate services, not only for carbon dioxide sequestration, but broad climate benefits, and I hope we'll have some time to talk about that, and for the water services of forests. And we have focused on developing policies in each of these areas that will drive financial return to private landowners for managing for those benefits complementary to timber harvest. For those of us in the forest space, development is kind of the big bad boogie that we raise. When we started the Pacific Forest Trust, the US was losing about 6,000 acres of forest land a year. That's the state of Delaware, a day. That's the state of Delaware in a year. And the reason for that is simple. Markets pay for development. And if you are a forest landowner and you adhere at all to what they call the prudent man rule, and I will just say it's not called the prudent woman rule, it is called the prudent man rule, you are very likely to be tempted by the value of development. And so when we look at the policies that are relied upon to support forests, they're targeted at trying to compensate for the development value. Now, they're also focused, those policies are focused on supporting a commodity market, because the belief has been that timber pays the bills, timber pays for forests to remain as forests. But we also know that timber harvest can be a significant cause of forest degradation. It's a source of CO2 emissions. It can impact sedimentation into water supplies. It definitely changes habitat values, and some people call plantations biological deserts. So we have policies that are skewed to supporting a commodity-based economy and saying that timber and timber products will pay the bills for forests. But this is not always the case, and that is why we have focused on finding ways to pay for these other values of forest, consistent with and complementary, leveraging timber harvest as a tool and utilizing timber products as one source of return, but not the sole one. The other piece of this context is that we have generally in our society an oppositional approach, which is cut or no cut. And the prevailing way of conserving forest land was to establish parks and public protected areas and then fight over how they're managed. But there are real limitations to that. There's not that much area that is in a condition that we want to necessarily have a new national park. And B, they're expensive to maintain. But most importantly, the notion here is that we as people are not smart enough or motivated enough to manage our private forest lands to also produce these public trust values. And we need to find ways to do that if we're going to be effective at actually preserving those public trust values of water provision, climate stabilization, and habitat, because we cannot do it simply in a kind of pockmarked fashion across the landscape. And so what has really been missing is why Pacific Forest Trust was founded. A very early observer of Pacific Forest Trust, said, I get it. You are those tree cutting, tree hugging, bridge building people. And that really is our focus, is we know that we're not going to be recreating, if you will, untouched forests. And in fact, there really isn't something as an untouched forest. The more we know about how people across the world have utilized fire for management and other tools for forest management, and how people have shaped forests, the more we recognize the need for people to be engaged and involved. And what we can do is manage for these older, more natural forests that actually do provide the services that we are looking for in terms of climate stabilization, mitigation, adaptation, watershed function, habitat function, and integrate a rural economy or a forest timber products based economy. So one of the things that has always puzzled me is that since so many people agree that forests and well-managed forests are so valuable, why don't we do more in that regard? But I'm just going to cover a little bit here about older, more natural forests. One is they really reduce your climate risk as a forest landowner because they are more able to withstand the temperature and precipitation extremes that are coming and that have arrived, and some of you are experiencing right now today from climate change and from fire risk and intensity. How these older forests respond to fire is vastly different than how plantations respond to fire. And here's an example. This is coming from the Bootleg Fire in Oregon State. And this is on public lands, but it's really valuable to look at. This was reestablished plantation. On one side of the slide, you can see where thinning was done to reduce fuel loads. In the middle is where thinning was done and prescribed fire was put back on the land, because these are lands that are very, very fire adapted. And the other is plantation that had not been treated for this. And you can see the difference of how the more naturally spaced with gaps and openings and larger trees available has responded to what was otherwise a pretty catastrophic fire. These older, more natural forests are extraordinarily valuable in their watershed function. And, it is something that we've all experienced, but you can walk through an older forest and you experience fog on your face or mist on your face. You know that those forests are collecting and milking from clouds and fog. And in fact, they but forests that have these older structures, older, more natural structures with variable canopies will attract and retain up to 25% more precipitation. They also hold snow longer. They have longer release times for that snow melt. And of course, we're all very familiar with having well-established riparian corridors with trees in them is cooler and cleaner water. But as a water security function, older, more natural forests are far and away the cheapest alternative we have to increasing water security. Additionally, those older, more natural forests are extraordinarily valuable in precipitation flood events. So I mentioned just a moment ago that these forests hold water longer. So when we have atmospheric rivers hitting, which is happening all over the country, when you have a more natural forest watershed managed, you will slow down flood intensity by 25 to 40%. And that means holding times of a week to 2 weeks longer, which means that our dams have more time to deal with regulating of water flow. So you're using the watershed as well as the reservoir as part of that flood control mechanism. And these are just a few examples of where we can utilize something called a working forest conservation easement. Pacific Forest Trust has conserved about 350,000 acres. We hold these working forest conservation easements on about 120,000 acres, and we manage about 15,000 acres of forest land directly. These working forest conservation easements not only protect lands from development and subdivision, but they guide how that forest is to be managed for the future. So they include a performance goal. What are we managing towards over time to restore these more natural forest functions broadly within ownerships, and therefore patch across many different kinds of ownership? And in the West, there's public, private, so you can create a much more broad effect of protecting private lands within that mixed ownership landscape. These older, more natural forests also hold significantly more carbon, and they are more climate resilient. And I'm going to flag there, and again, I hope there will be questions around this, about how carbon and climate relate, because they are not exactly the same thing. But we see working forest conservation easements as the real foundation for the long-term endurance of forests for all of us. And I'm going to turn to that now, because this is an extraordinary synergy that happens between that long-term conservation and supporting ongoing commercial activity and supporting our safer climate future, while at the same time really building up the long-term security of rural economies. And, you know, with all of that, you go, gosh, that sounds great. Why aren't we doing it? And the real fundamental question in the end is that pocketbook matters. So how do you raise the kind of public capital that will effectuate change at the large scale that we need within our forest landscapes? And this is just an image of a couple of forests that we manage. Here's one in Oregon, where we have taken a 7,200 acre tree farm, where the trees were all, well, they were 90% 20 years and under when we took it over. And in the 22 years that we've been managing it under a working forest conservation easement, we have quadrupled the carbon stores, and we have done more than that in terms of timber yield. Every year we get about 3 million board foot equivalent off of this forest. And this, it's on its way, though. You can see we've created the kind of structure, the beginnings of real forest structure and some change in composition. And then the picture on the right is of a forester with a third generation away, emerging forester, where we harvest again about 1.5 million to 2 million board foot a year. And we have tripled the stocking, the commercial stocking on the property, where we've also quadrupled the carbon stocks on it. So let's talk about funding at scale for private landowners for the most existential question that I believe we face in terms of the health of the planet, and that is climate change. Earlier this year on Earth Day, the governor of California announced new targets for incorporating the natural and working lands sector into the climate solutions for the state. as Peter mentioned, we were very active. In fact, we led the inclusion of forests within California state policy in the Wayback Machine. We did it through incorporating forests' ability to provide offsets for carbon. This became the first compliance regime which rewarded landowners for maintaining standing forests and for managing for older forests. So carbon offsets have become well known. They're in use in 35 states across the US, and they have created a multi-billion-dollar economy. That's great. It's limited, it's a business-to-business opportunity, and it is a very single-shot approach to leveraging the value of forests in climate solutions. And so it is a good tool, but it's an insufficient tool, and it's often limited in terms of what it achieves, because again, it's often a single commodity approach. We also, within the state of California, were able to pass a law that categorized forests as part of our water system infrastructure for the first time that's been done in the US, where the watersheds were classified as important as the dams, pipes, and canals that deliver people water. But that has proven to be, while a good policy tool, it has not yet really emerged as a market per se. With climate, where we have been able to go, and I really want to point out your attention to the last of these 4 areas here, working forest conservation. We now have over 200,000 acres of conservation targets a year for the state in terms of driving the change to a more carbon-rich and climate-resilient forested landscape. Forests comprise roughly a third of the state. Now, these targets also apply to all other land types within the state as well. But what's incredibly important in my mind is it is the first time that this is looking at this as a sector. So to give you a sense of this, if you were thinking about transportation, we talk about transportation as emissions as a sector. You would never seek to solve emissions issues by simply focusing solely on the electrification of cars. We have boats, planes, trucks, all kinds of modes of transportation. You need to look at it as a whole. Or in energy, just by switching to LED light bulbs, you could not change the energy picture really significantly. The same is true with offsets. We need to be looking at the large landscape level and at the whole of it and at all the benefits. So when I talk about climate, I am not talking simply about carbon sequestration, but I am also talking about resilience and stability. So those quote unquote co-benefits that Peter mentioned are equally important. Water is hardly a co-benefit in climate, it's a core benefit. Biodiversity is a core benefit. Fire safety or fire risk reduction is actually a core benefit. And all of these are being addressed in this larger picture. And it is also going beyond the commodity area of conifer forests alone, which in the West, conifer, of course, the softwood timber industry is the timber industry as opposed to some portions of the country where it's a hardwood one. But we are also looking at reestablishing our oak woodlands and looking at how in the course of this, we integrate active management to restore those more natural and resilient conditions as part of the picture. So this is the first announcement, obvious of a sector-based target, and really moving to scale, because a few 100,000 acres a year is really moving to the scale that we need. If you think about the climate crisis, we are 3 years into that 10-year window that scientists talk to us about for the tipping point of our climate survival. To avoid the worst risks. I think many of us are already experiencing some of those risks. And forests are the single most immediate solution we can work with. Just by working with under 5% of private forest lands in the state of California, we can do more in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of emissions reductions than the entire transportation sector alone. So that's really, really critical. And that's why I go back to the opening of this is an existential question. We have been slowly ramping up forest conservation. We need to scale that dramatically, and it needs to be active. And so with that, I will say thank you for the opportunity. And if you would like any more work about our organization, there's a website right there. I will stop screen sharing.
And thank you, Laurie, for that great overarching presentation. I'm going to ask you a few questions or ask you to go a little deeper on some of the items that you've already shared. You and I are both longtime practitioners of working forest conservation easements. For those of you who are listening, the Lime Timber Company has done 1.1 million acres worth of working forest conservation easements in a total of 9 states across the US. We are remarkably supportive of the additional funding that came out of both the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act that is supporting at the federal level programs like the Forest Legacy Program. But I would argue that, Laurie, you and I are overly familiar. So if you could just take a step back and maybe unpack exactly what a working forest conservation easement is, I think that would be a great help to the listening audience.
Sure. I think of working forest conservation easements as the essence of a public-private partnership approach to our forest infrastructure for those people. So when you own a forest, you own a series of rights about what you can do with that forest. The right to harvest timber, the right to subdivide, the right to build, the right to convert it to agriculture, all kinds of rights. And what a conservation easement does is the conservation easement is a partial interest in land. And it restricts some or all of those rights, depending upon what the private landowner wants to do and what the funding source that will pay for that is willing to do. So what I was talking about in my earlier talk was that the classic approach would be to buy off the subdivision and development rights that a landowner had to maintain that land in open space. But open space alone does not a forest make. And so the additional rights that are acquired under a working forest conservation easement is a portion of the timber harvest rights, for example, or a portion of rights that also limits grazing that might happen. So it's a remarkably flexible legal tool, which is permanent, and that is a deed. So it is a property deed that restricts and guides how that forest is to be managed and maintained for the future. So it's appraisable. It pays landowners full value for the rights that they are giving up. And in some cases, if it's a private landowner, there may also be tax deductions of it associated with that. So it's a very, very plastic and financially flexible tool that rewards landowners for managing for the public benefits of their land forever.
Great. Now to move kind of to the other side of the work of Pacific Forest Trust, some of the policy work. I even learned some things about what your organization is doing based on this presentation. And you've, what I would describe as you've broadened the palette of policy options, policy innovations over the years. And just a little more color, a little more flavor, I'm talking to all of you from Hanover, New Hampshire, which is more or less halfway up the state of New Hampshire in the Connecticut River Valley. And the average temperature in mid-June historically has been between 65 and 78 degrees. And today we are 19 degrees warmer than the high end of that average. So it's a hot day in Hanover, New Hampshire. And I'm pretty sure it's a hot day everywhere east of the 100th meridian, so half the country. So climate benefits, not just carbon, and you were really clear, but climate benefits, whether it's resilience around intensive storm events, whether it's the watershed protection function. If you could go a little further into some of those outcomes, some of those deliverables that forests provide, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. Well, let me share a story about temperature and impacts on forests, because one of the things that you often hear about forests as a climate solution is, oh, they're very risky. they're going to all burn up, or they won't be able to withstand the heat. So we can't rely on them. And potentially that is true, but equally our best shot at making sure that's not true is how we manage these forests. So the story I want to share is that on one forest that we manage, we are a natural forest management island within a plantation sea. And in the state of Oregon, we had a huge scorch event just 3 years ago. And our neighbors literally all had to replant because their young plantations all died. We did not. And we did not because we have some trees that are taller, some trees that are smaller. We were able to create, if you will, these temperature mitigation areas where older trees provided shade for younger trees, and also the pattern on the landscape of large structure and small structure creates air turbulence. So there's airflow in a way that there isn't on a completely even homogeneous plantation landscape. The other thing is that older trees use less water than younger trees. And there's been really good research showing that, and this is particularly important for areas that are all over the country experiencing both more drought and more extreme precipitation. Like, who can make it through that stress? So older forests use about 40% less water than thirsty young plantations. We used to call it, if they're healthy young plantations, they grow so fast. But it's like cell division in a baby. Those, they need a lot to keep going. If they need more water, they have shallow root systems, they suck it up, they release it out in transpiration. Whereas these older trees have much deeper, more established root systems. So what we have sought to do, Peter, in the policy realm is take all the really fabulous science that's out there about what forests do and look for ways that we can integrate those benefits into existing legal systems and practice systems so that we can drive income to landowners. So that's on the water side, where we found that there was already an existing law that said water consumers pay for repair and maintenance of water infrastructure. But water infrastructure didn't include watersheds. So what good are your dams without a functioning watershed? And we were able to show to lawmakers that really we were missing half the picture with that. And so we were able to get watersheds included as part of that water system infrastructure. In the West, as they say, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. So we're still working through on the private side how that will be paid for, but it has definitely made a difference in funding on the public side. So that's one kind of example.
Those are great.
Yeah.
Because one of the questions that just popped up touches a little bit on where you were going with these kind of putting back uneven age structure is the type of forest management, the type of what I would call natural forest management that Pacific Forest Trust does on land that it manages and advocates through the conservation easements that it holds in the policy work. How does that help ensure survivability of young trees?
So we have embraced, from the reforestation perspective, we very much embrace the knowledge of how forests were structured when Europeans came to the country. And fire was a really strong management tool for Native Americans. So forests are not uniform, they're a matrix. Not only are there trees, but there are dry meadows and wet meadows or riparian areas. They are not just a blanket of trees. And those trees have different ages. When the country was settled by Europeans. And people thought of that as quote unquote old growth, as if it were a static thing. But in fact, it was very dynamic because fire was a key management tool. So there were younger and older forests, but those species were adapted to the kind of structure that was there. So one way of calling that is what they call clumps, openings, and individual trees. The terminology is ICO, individuals, clumps, and openings. So it's variability. And so we plant fewer trees per acre. So instead of when we started the Pacific Forest, believe it or not, people were putting in 2,000 trees to the acre. These are acres that can support a couple hundred or less. So when we reforest, we do not put in on an acre that we have, if we've done, for example, a small group selection, we're not going to put in more than 300 or so trees to that acre. So we're providing for more moisture within that. And we have a lot of retention. Our minimum retention is 20 to 30% in typical. So there's a shade that's available. You have a functioning mycorrhizal network still. That's really important to provide for the nutrient transfer across individual trees. So those are different ways that we look at that. And we follow a natural mix of seedling types. So that's also really important from the point of view of what species are susceptible to what stress. You know, Douglas fir has a certain range of temperature it's happy in. It's different than hemlocks. It's different from western red cedar. It's different from spruce. And by having that variability within that, you increase the likelihood that a single stress event is not going to wipe out everything.
Notwithstanding all the great policy work that you do, you are a participant in a national association of land trusts called the Land Trust Alliance. And I'm going to ask a question that I hope is comfortable. Like, how can you help or support more land trusts getting involved in the policy realm that like the work that Pacific Forest Trust has done? I find land trusts have great, credible, authentic relationships with private landowners, but maybe you shouldn't quote me, they're kind of scared about policy issues by and large. There are a few exceptions, but not as many as I would like to see. So any advice for the larger land trust community about moving policies forward at the state level, at the federal level, that would enhance land trust's ability to actually scale, not just acres, but the type of practices that you just described?
That's a great question.
You can say no, I don't want to answer that. But...
No, I think no. Land trusts traditionally emerged largely around individual places and communities that people wanted to protect that place. That is not dissimilar from the notion that when we look at our parks, we're protecting a jewel. Individual places of beauty and value. I think we are at a place where we recognize that the value of land, absolutely beauty, awe, inspiration are important. But without water, without a stable climate, we don't have a fabulous world to pass on to our next generations. And so we have to change that perspective of why private land conservation is important. And I think, frankly, the climate crisis is a catalytic moment for that, for land trusts, large and small. But seeing the value of what we do, and I definitely experienced this in chairing the committee that led to those targets that you all saw that are now the state targets in the state of California. Across all land types, there is a really strongly emerging understanding that we need to scale at a larger level for those services to be there. And it is not an antagonistic, I'm right, you're wrong approach. And I think that has been a fear for many land trusts, is if they advocated for something, that would be seen as being partisan on one side or the other. But advocating for enough water, I think all sides got to drink in order to argue, right? You know, it's really fundamental. we have to have livable temperatures in which to be, or everybody's going to concentrate just in one small place, which is unsurvivable as well. So I think that by stepping back from the I'm right, you're wrong, to looking at what motivates people to collaborate in conservation. All of this private land conservation is voluntary. Feeling good about it is great. Having money is even better. Have the two together, you got a winning formula. And for land trusts to see that as a non-controversial issue, I think is the pathway forward, and sharing stories of where it works.
Thank you. That's great. Going to the Q&A, there are a couple of questions about both old growth forests, and I think you already answered that. Old growth forest does not mean no touch forests. And I think you clarified that, but I just wanted to repeat it. At the same time, we do, and I've been very involved with Blue Forest Conservation and their forest resilience bonds and some of the work that the National Forest Foundation is doing. But one of the, and this is actually a question from Portugal, but it's very true in the US as well. One of the weak parts of the solution matrix is the workforce. Are there enough foresters, forest technicians? Are we using the most modern technology equipment to do the kind of restoration forestry that's necessary to deliver the water quality benefits, the resilience benefits that you described? I know that workforce is not the central issue that Pacific Forest Trust focuses on, but anyone working in the forest sector is thinking about this. We confront it at the Lime Timber Company on a daily basis in populating logging crews. So any thoughts or information you could share? I know that in the state of California, there's been some very recent state support for expanding workforce at the state level, but anything that you can add about workforce?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. But I think, again, it's like looking at what are the drivers of why there isn't the workforce. One, working in the forest, timber harvest is seen as very boom and bust, up and down, and a lot of mechanization. Where's the long-term future? If the long-term future is all in tech, why would I even go in there? It's really dangerous. I don't want to do it. The other thing is that young people, by and large, and I see this a tremendous amount in college ages, is like, I don't want to go into forestry. That's the bad stuff.
Right.
Those are the people causing harm. So, two things. One is putting the forest back in forestry, and really making sure that as we educate these next group of people coming forward, they see the good that they are doing. And that's really clear as an outcome. And two is providing opportunities and training for that. Three is also in terms of driving support out of the 1757 committee that I've chaired. Part of that is that nexus of the next generation. What we're doing directly is we've started an education program for high school and above to train people coming in with a demonstration for us for what does climate resilience look like? What does fire resilience look like? And to bring high school students in, give them a taste of all the different aspects of real forestry, not just timber harvest. Timber harvest is a tool. It's an incredibly important tool. So is being able to operate road equipment well. So is being able to know where to place your culverts well. You get to have a lot of fun in the forest. But if you expose people to that at young ages, and they can see that it is building part of their future in a stable way. So that's really critical, building the long-term funding. And I think there are ways to do that, in particular around fire and community safety, as well as water. But that I think is really critical. And we have to walk the talk, not just talk the talk about forests.
Cool. I'm going to go down a little deeper on the water issue. You and I have had experiences with each state has a clean water state revolving fund, and Lime Timber has accessed that funding because we have invested in and therefore own the private forests that are the public watershed water supply location in rural communities in a number of places in the East. And this is an infrastructure fund, but these funds doubled in the last 2 years and are more flexible. I put this, I didn't put it in the Q&A, I'm asking this question, but I wonder if you would comment on the Clean Water Revolving Funds and your view of their utility in actually providing some of the payments. I mean, this in the case of what we're doing in Pennsylvania, this was very concessionarily priced debt, so there really was a public payment to a private landowner to deliver watershed protection. So take it away.
You know, you probably have more direct experience with revolving funds than I do, because you've had some successful utilizations of them directly. I have not, and the big sticking point has been the repayment for that. And there's certain also some states structure it differently than others, so it's more difficult in neither California nor Oregon have we successfully accessed those funds. So I'm going to pass on that question.
Well, I wanted to give you one that you didn't have to address.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the only other question that's in the chat, in some ways, I think, was already addressed, which is very much Laurie has described. It is the practice at Lime Timber and many other third-party certified managers out there to do active management. Now, there may be portions of the property where the habitat is so significant, or habitat qualities are so significant, or operational constraints suggest that it's more or less impossible to do active management. But speak again a little bit to active management, because I think that's delivering this more resilient structure that existed, let's say, 300 years ago, and was eroded by more conventional forest management schemes over the last 100 years.
Yeah. Well, actually, we don't have any areas in our conservation easements that are not open to management. And one thing I didn't mention is that we have used our working forest conservation easements as the underpinning for safe harbor agreements, 99-year safe harbor agreements, because of the and low impact HCPs, because of the ability to restore and then maintain the kind of habitat conditions that support listed species. And that's actually another first. But I think the point of that is that we simply don't believe in so-called no touch. When we put fire back on the landscape, that's a touch. Thinning to restore riparian corridors, that's a touch. But the focus of it, so we don't have a problem. You cut the trees for absolutely, sell the trees, absolutely. It's what does it look like on the ground? What are you achieving through that matters? And I think we get too hung up about, you know, the tool and some of the terminology around that. So that's really a key in looking at how you restore and maintain these functions is not by, it really isn't by the set aside approach per se. It may, so there's a question in the chat about, you know, thinning your forest to death, never doing a final harvest. Well, I actually don't agree that there's something called a final harvest unless you want to say 600-year-old trees. Okay, we're going to harvest that at 600. Okay, you want to look out that far? Go for it. I just don't think that when you look at how natural forest functions, there's an age limit to the representation on the landscape. If you will, again, going back to that pre-European condition, the dominant age classes in this country were 200 years and above. That was over 60% of the forest type was 200 years and above. About 20% was in the 100 to 200%, 200 years. And about 20% was in the 1 to 100 years. If you look at it today, it's completely flipped the other way. So I respect the notion of time here a lot. I don't know that there's something called a final harvest within that.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. Maybe the last one or two questions, which would be one, notwithstanding the fact that you and I agree about everything you presented, I actually think that the pro-forestation, the no-touch movement has been better communicating to the general public. Now, obviously, what Pacific Forest Trust does is complex, complicated, requires many partners. But talk a little bit about how do voters understand this? Now, how does the general public understand this form of what I would call working lands conservation versus creating a new national park or a new state park?
I actually think that this is where the discussion about forests and other lands as part of the climate solution can be very powerful. In that, you're absolutely right that the simple statement no or the simple statement don't, that responds to people's sense of, okay, I got it, that clarity. And the pro-forestation movement, I think, has had more impact in the East than in the West, within the US or the South or the Midwest. But I do think that one really clear, helpful thing, Peter, is to convey that when we're talking about forests, we're talking about forests. We are not talking about tree plantations. We're not talking about tree farms per se, where it's a simple, homogeneous commodity production, because that's the difference. Forests are not cornfields. And yes, we use all of those products. I use those products, and you can get those products from natural forest management as well. But I think if we're able to successfully focus and with real clarity about what we mean by a forest, I think we will gain that public support. And that's where being able to move a state that does not necessarily identify itself as a forest state. Oregon does. California is like, yeah, those are in the public lands. But to move that larger conversation to understanding that it's a landscape and it is a forest and it's critical for climate, I think is persuasive to people.
Well, this is going to be, I think, the last one, which is, I think many people on the call will understand that if the family read the Sand County Almanac, they'll immediately get comfortable with these strategies. But that's a significant amount of private land in America are those kinds of families. But another significant amount are the timber investment management organizations, the publicly traded timber real estate investment trusts, what we used to call the industrial owners.
Right.
And some of them are, very, very much plain vanilla, meaning their trees line up, their roads are straight, it's a plantation. But others are deeply invested in natural forests. I happen to know, but I wanted you to answer the question, that there have been very positive experiences between, again, using a slightly old term, the industrial owner and Pacific Forest Trust. But if you could share one or two examples of that.
Sure. Well, we just concluded a transaction with Campbell Global, which is part of JP Morgan Chase. We've worked with Roseburg Timber. We've worked with Collins Pine, now simply known as Collins. We worked with Hancock. You can take a large scale owner and we've worked with them. And that is because, again, it's a complementary income stream to long-term timber supply. And ensuring that in some respects, this is the Forever Employment Act for loggers and foresters, is working with a group like ours. So we do have foresters on staff. We ourselves cut trees, we sell trees, we understand mills. We can speak from that same perspective. But the critical issue here, and I'm going to go back to climate, we need billions of dollars into this as a climate strategy. That's where this new sectoral approach is so important. Carbon offsets are business to business opportunities individually that will not mobilize the scale of capital we need for this solution. If we want these large owners to come to the table, they will not do it solely out of the kindness of their hearts. They do respond to their investors, and that is why we have to mobilize the public capital. Working with forests constructively is the single most large scale, least expensive, off the shelf way to go. So if we can dedicate the billions of dollars that we are into battery technology, into electrification of transportation, into new kinds of non-polluting fuels for because we're not going to get battery powered flight for quite a while, I don't think. Although that could change, you never know. This is where that's the kind of capital that we need to address the climate crisis. And this solution is so much cheaper, more immediately available and effective than any other we had out there. It's not a competition, it's a complementarity. And that is what we need to focus on to bring these very large scale, more industrial, classically industrial ownerships into the solution.
I could not think of a better way to summarize and this presentation than the last few words that Laurie just shared. I'm going to turn it back to Tanya, who's going to close us out. And I just wanted to thank everybody who participated for spending a little more than the last hour with us. And I just also want to remind you, if you haven't supported the Forest History Society yet, seriously consider doing so.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Peter Stein, our guest host, and thank you so much, Laurie Wayburn, for an excellent presentation.